this online leadership hustings for the Eastern Counties region, and a special welcome to our two leadership candidates, Ed Davey and Layla Moran.
Now, I'm so sorry, Don. We've for some reason the video hasn't gone. One sec, we'll just have to ask you to repeat it. Apologies. Okay, sorry. Here, it's actually gone up. My apologies. Do you carry on?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this online leadership husting for the Eastern Counties region, and a special welcome to our two leadership candidates, Ed Davey and Layla Moran. Now, I'm Don Foster, the former Bath MP and currently president of the region. Now, please be aware that this is an open meeting and we may well have non-members and journalists joining us. Thankfully, many of you have already submitted questions, so I apologize in advance to those whose questions we don't have time to reach. And in some cases where there have been several questions on similar topics, we have amalgamated them so that we can get in as many issues as possible in the 90 minutes available. But you can still be involved by posing new questions or asking follow-up questions to what Ed and Layla have said. Please use the box on the right of your screen where it says type here to ask further questions or make comment. Please give us your name, and please also remember we're a party that prides ourselves in treating everyone with respect. To start us off, each of the candidates will have up to 3 minutes for opening remarks, and Ed is going to kick us off. So over to you, Ed.
Economy and climate. I think for too long they've been separated. I have a radically different approach. Every policy, from the economy to foreign affairs, must focus on climate change, bringing the economy and the environment together. So I published a green recovery plan, green homes, green transport, green energy, a rewilding of natural habitats with a green jobs guarantee. This is the sort of green vision I think we should be selling. And I can deliver it because I've experienced doing it before. I fought the Tories on climate and I won, nearly quadrupling Britain's renewable power. I brought green jobs to communities in decline, like 1,000 manufacturing jobs in Hull, making turbine blades for wind farms, jobs in Lowestoft, for example. My eco passion came from reading Seeing Green, aged 18. It's where I also discovered how a universal basic income could be designed to help the most vulnerable. And working as Paddy Ashdown's economics advisor, I developed the party's first ever UBI. So to something like a UBI vision, I bring real experience and my training as an economist. But beyond a greener, fairer society, post-COVID, I believe we should also be the party of caring, the party for carers. Our country's 10 million carers. I've experienced caring, first as a young carer. My dad died when I was 4, so when mum became terminally ill when I was a teenager, I nursed her with my brothers. Now, Emily and I care for our wonderful children, including my severely disabled son, John, who needs 24/7 care. So I do understand what millions of carers go through every day. And I think my life experience helps me relate to people, to voters across the board, to their challenges. And then the party's challenges. In the general election view, it's really clear. It does not say the way forward is as simple as moving on from the coalition. We tried that in 2017 with the leader who'd actually voted against the coalition's most controversial measures. It didn't help. The general election's 61 pages and many recommendations make clear there's no quick fix to our problems. But it's interesting, it says our most serious problem is that we've not been telling people what Liberal Democrats stand for. And my vision begins to do that, a greener, fairer, more caring society. And with a clear vision, we can win. I'm an experienced campaigner. I'm the only MP in our party's history to win at a general election without being a target seat. I know how to win. And that's why most of our best campaigners are backing me. They're backing my vision and my experience to win. So please back me too. Thank you.
Ed, thank you very much indeed. And now Layla.
Well, firstly, thank you, Don. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Our country needs a strong, liberal voice, one that makes a heartfelt, compelling case for truly progressive values as we rebuild our society in the wake of coronavirus. But in order to be this voice, our party must change. It is essential. A steady as she goes approach risks our voice being stifled and the Tories redefining our society in their way. And we must do better than the last 3 elections and the current 6 to 8% in the polls. I have a plan to rebuild trust and win again as your leader. Listening sessions with over 300 local parties, many of them on this call tonight, have informed my vision to transform Britain into a fairer, greener, more compassionate society. My 3 campaign themes of education, the environment and the economy all reinforce that overall message. And it attracts attention. Throughout this campaign, I've been on 5 front pages, secured over 300 media hits, and I have that media cut through that we need to be able to stand out from the crowd. Talking about those bread and butter issues that really matter to people in a distinctly progressive and liberal way. This is how we are going to build that broad base of support across the moderate political spectrum. It's how I overturned a 10,000 Tory majority in my seat with a message and a plan that attracted thousands of soft Conservatives, as well as galvanizing Labour and Green voters to not just vote for us, but also campaign for us. This is what we need to replicate nationally. But before 2024, we need that laser-like focus on maximizing our gains in local elections. And we also need to support our teams. No business would invest as little in its staff as we currently do in our volunteers and our party staff. My aim is to change our party for the better so that we can move forward together and change our country for the better. For far too long, we've been explaining the past rather than campaigning for the future. I want to become leader of the Liberal Democrats because I believe that there are millions of people out there waiting to hear that positive, distinctly liberal message from a messenger that they can trust. I know how to win over soft Conservatives and the centre left. I stand out from the crowd and I can make liberalism mainstream again. There is a burning need for change in our country and a burning need for revival of the Liberal Democrats. I am the person to lead that charge. Thank you.
Layla, thank you very much as well. We're going to move into questions. And as I say, some of these are composited as a result of large numbers of people raising the same issue. We're going to start the first question. And Layla, if you could be ready to answer it first. This is from Patsy and Alan and a number of other people. And the question is, what have you learned from past leaders or leadership periods? And what would you do differently? How would you make the Liberal Democrats relevant to our nation's future? Layla.
Well, Patsy and Alan, I think what you're asking there is the question that we need to answer right now as a party. You know, what are we for? Very clearly is one of the things that when I've been door knocking around the country is clearly coming back as the thing that people just don't know about us. And that relevance is a big part of it, because showing people what Liberal Democrats can do for them now. Why should they vote Liberal Democrat now? What is it? What's in it for them? And that's the big question. So that's why I've put forward as part of my campaign the themes of education, the environment, and the economy. Education, because as Liberals, we believe in the empowered citizen. We have to make sure that we're investing in that next generation. We have to make sure that we are showing people who we are as a party, and we're clear about that. And so education is a natural space for us. It's what Paddy did when we were on the up, and what Charles did as well, as he spoke to people's hearts in a way that really made him trustworthy to them. We need to get back to those winning ways, and it's by talking about those bread and butter issues that really matter to people on doors that I I'm so determined that we do, because by making us trustworthy and relevant again, that is how at the next election, in those 30 to 50 seats that are going to be our top targets, most of them Conservative facing, many of them very similar to Oxford, West and Abingdon, if we're going to garner that support that we need to win those voters over, then we need to make sure that we've got that relevant message that really speaks to their hearts and not just their heads.
Thank you, Leila. Ed.
Patsy Allen, great question. For me, the leader that inspired me the most was Paddy. I was his economics advisor. And during that time, we pulled ourselves up from a situation not dissimilar from now. And the way he did it was focusing in on the brand of the party, what we were for. He was really clear with his vision. And rather like mine, he focused on the green agenda and the education agenda. And I very much helped him with that. I helped develop the policy of a penny income tax for education, and we became known as the Green Party under Paddy. So I really want to make sure people really understand what we're about. And the other thing I learned from Paddy, again, quite similar to the situation we're in now, is how you work with the Labour Party. Paddy was clear we were an anti-conservative party, but he was very skillful in how he did the choreographing with Tony Blair. So we got tactical voting working for us really big. So we both squeezed the Labour Party seats we could win and won over soft Tories. So that's what I did in the 97 election under Paddy's leadership. What would I do differently? That was also part of your question. Well, I tell you what, the last few years, our campaigning has really gone backwards. We've done far too much national leaflets, overriding what the local parties knew best. And the general election review that I co-commissioned made it really clear we've got to change that. So the lessons that I would want to follow from things that haven't worked so well in the past are all in that general election review. I think we have to implement that.
Ed, thank you very much. And you mentioned working with other parties, and we have a couple of questions coming up which will give an opportunity to expand your thinking. And indeed, the first one is people like Steve, Nick, Daryl, Roger, and many others have asked, the 2010 to 2015 coalition has undoubtedly left its mark on our party. So what lessons can be learned from it? And also, would having been a minister in the coalition government be an advantage or a disadvantage for the leader of the Liberal Democrats? And we'll start with Ed.
Well, let's start with that last bit of the question first. I think it's an advantage. Whoever is the leader of the party is going to have to answer the question, well, what do you think of the coalition, whether it's Leila or myself? I'll have a really good answer. I will say that I nearly quadrupled Britain's renewable power, having fought the Tories and won. And I'd be able to then talk about what we want to do at the 2024 election. So I think I could use my success in beating the Tories and in promoting that green agenda, that green jobs, that green economic agenda, and talk about our future policies with some credibility, which frankly no other party leader would be able to say. In terms of what I learned from the coalition as overall, I'd say two things. First of all, you've got to get the messaging right. I mean, there were some good policies. We achieved so much of the Liberal Democrat agenda. A lot of more liberal thought went into that government than probably ever before. Things like on mental health, things like the pupil premium, things like legislating for equal marriage. Those things were fantastic. But we got wrong the messaging. We didn't show that we were fighting the Tories so much of the time. We didn't show that we were distinctive from the Tories. And I was complaining about that at the time, but unfortunately, I wasn't listened to. We got the messaging wrong. So I'd like to do that very differently. The only other thing I'd say is I knew how to get one over on the Tories. I think I was the most successful minister in beating the Tories, and I enjoyed it so much. Beating George Osborne, beating Eric Pickles, I can tell you I really enjoyed that. But I'm clear, I'll never go into coalition with the Tories again. This Tory party is so right-wing, so Brexit. I've ruled out coalition, supply and confidence, any arrangement with them. I've spent my life fighting and beating the Tories. I want to do that, and I don't want to do it so that we have a progressive, centre-left, liberal reformist government next time after the next election.
Thank you, Ed. Leila.
Well, first, to be really clear, I want to move on from coalition, but moving on doesn't mean disowning. You can't rewrite your past. And I do get asked about the coalition. But if you want to answer the question, is a minister a help or a hindrance, I would just refer you to the questioning that Joe had in that last election that we just went through, that question time where the audience were asking questions about the voting record, the Andrew Neil interview, where on the one hand, we were trying to put forward, you know, liberal, progressive ideas, and then on the other hand, it being undermined by a vote that had happened before. And it still comes up on doors, perhaps not in Tory-facing areas where we are strong, but when I went door knocking in many Labour-facing areas, areas that we do need to start winning council seats in again, and that we need to have one eye on for perhaps not 2024, but for the 2029 general election. If we are going to start winning back trust with the electorate, then we need to find a way to move the narrative away from the past and into the future so that we can really make that case for what do we stand for now. And when Michael Gove and others try and steal the people premium, I'm right there trying to take it back from him. He cannot rewrite history either. But we have to know that one of the things that went wrong, and one of the things that continues to go wrong, is that we undermined trust. And it was because we said that we were one thing and then did something else. And when you've got politicians that do that, they have a price to pay. So if we are going to rebuild, and that is what we have to do now, guys. I mean, let's be perfectly honest about where we are now. 6 to 8% in the polls, 3 general elections where you wake up the next morning, albeit notwithstanding some great results, but with the general sense of disappointment, because we just haven't made those leaps forward. We need to show people that we have changed, and owning the coalition means owning the bedroom tax. It means owning tuition fees and not showing that we've learned from them, that we've changed as a result, and that we won't breach that trust with the electorate again. So that's what we need to do. In addition to the big party reforms, we need to get people to look at us again. They need to look at the Lib Dems and go, do you know what? I know what they stand for. I understand where they sit in the political spectrum. And that is liberal, not left, not right, but liberal. It's been a long time since liberalism was discussed positively in this country. It's really interesting, the conversations I've been having in this leadership election with journalists and others. They just don't get it. We need to show people who we are, that positive vision for the future. And I'm the leader to help us revive again.
Leila, thank you. Moving on from that, which you both touched on a little bit, is cooperation with other parties. Large number of our members have asked questions about this: Glyn, Sue, Ben, Rosemary, John, Sean, James, Esther, and several others. The question we're going to put is this. This week, Martin Kettle, the Guardian columnist, wrote an article entitled "Liberalism is Fighting for Its Life. There's only one way to survive." And in it, he suggests that if we choose cooperation and compromise, there may be a way back. So will you start talks with other progressive parties on ways to ensure no election can be won on a minority of the votes? And Leila, if you'd like to kick off with that.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, you can only start by agreeing to an extent with his assessment. I mean, one thing that I am noticing is people just don't know what liberalism means right now. And I think we need to make the case for it. We need to tell them what it means. And the elevator pitch, bluntly, for it is it's about freedom. You know, the clue is in the name: liberal, freedom, and freedom to lead the best life that you possibly can. One where you thrive in your community, where you have total ownership over your own destiny. But we also appreciate that in order to be free to do that, you need to be free from ignorance, poverty, and conformity, all those things, those wonderful things that send shivers down my spine every time I talk about them on the preamble to our constitution, on our membership cards. But we need to make that relevant to people. And that's why, you know, if the party does the policies, then the job of the leader is to make sure that that translates in a way that's really compelling to people, and also to make those links cross-party, so that we can, at the next election, deliver one of the big aims of that, which is a change fundamentally to our democracy, to make sure that all votes count, and that's electoral reform. Now, I'm already working on this behind the scenes in the Houses of Parliament. I think that there is a movement, a big one, in the Labour Party that seems to be bringing them on board. I will always remain sceptical of what Labour say that they might want at this stage and what they might be able to deliver down the line. But cross-party working and collaboration is part of my DNA. It's how I operate. It's how I got the Greens, for example, to stand not behind me, but beside me in both of the elections where I massively increased my vote against the Tories. It's actually one of the things that I think we need to be doing on the ground, is start to be rebuilding trust with other parties, in a sense, playing the first past the post system against itself, so that we can make sure that they don't just vote for us, they come out campaigning for us. I had Labour Party members in the dead of night with hoods on delivering leaflets, because if they were caught, they might have been kicked out of the party, but they were so motivated and inspired that they helped us achieve these huge gains against the Tories. That's what we need to do. That's what we need to replicate. And that's why collaboration right now is the way to go.
Ed?
Short answer is yes, cooperate with other centre-left parties, but there's 3 steps to do that. The first is to make sure people know what the Liberal Democrats stand for, what liberalism means today, that we are the opponents of this nationalist, populist xenophobia. We've got to show that it's Boris Johnson, the right wing, the Brexiteers, who are doing so much damage to our country, our society, and our world, and how we have a much more positive, optimistic, outward-looking approach as liberals, where we value every individual person, show respect to everyone, not just in this country, but across the world. And I think if we can then go into the second stage with a position of strength, that people know who we stand for, and we're winning elections at local level and so on, then I think we can look at our alternative and our prospective partners, of course, the Labour Party, and see what we think of them. Now, so far, Keir Starmer looks like someone we can work with. It's so refreshing after the Corbyn era. You know, I actually think he looks much more like a Tony Blair. And when I worked for Paddy, it was really clear that Paddy and Blair in private really clicked, and they were working through that common ground. So I think Starmer is good news for us, and that's stage 2 of the, if you like, of the cooperation. And if we're strong again with a clear liberal vision, and if we can work with Keir again, as I hope and believe we can, then the question is, how do you do that? And I think pre-election, I wouldn't go down the PAC route, not least because we're going to have to fight Labour in some areas, you know, in Cambridge, in parts of London, in parts of the north. You know, we should be unapologetic about that, just agree in a mature way that we'll have to fight them in some areas. But in the areas that matter to beat the Tories, just as Paddy did with Tony Blair, we need to take the Tories on, and we need Labour to move out of our target seats, and we've got to, you know, down the dial in their target seats. And then we can make first past the post work for the progressive part of politics, the liberal part of politics, and we can beat the Tories as we did in 97, 2001, when I was first winning my seats. And you know, if we do that, then I think we can get PR. It's got to be an absolute strategic objective. This time, we've messed it up before, not this time. If we get the chance in a hung parliament we've got lots of MPs and Labour's the largest party, we can do that coalition. PR has got to be the top priority.
Thank you very much, Ed. We're moving on to a different area with a question from Jude, who asks, how do you intend to engage with young people to show them that they really can influence politics in their country? And Ed, if you'd like to kick off.
Well, first, it's a national picture, remembering that young people are very different. There's no such thing as a young person. And I think our positions on Brexit, on climate change, really put us in a good place. But we've got to have strong issues on things like jobs and housing. That's what young people are increasingly concerned about. And I've been someone who's campaigned on housing, you know, much of my life. I met my wife, Emily, in a Liberal Democrat housing policy working group. So you probably think I should have SAD written across my forehead, but you talk a lot of housing. She's now the housing portfolio holder in Kingston Council. She's building lots of council houses, much to my delight and pride. You know, if we build those houses, affordable houses, if we really show young people that housing is something that Liberal Democrats care about and have a real solution, and we're going to make sure that the planning rules work so we can get those houses, you know, I think young people will come to us. But I think my final point on young people is that you've got to listen to them. You've really got to listen to them. This year will mark my 25th visit to Kingston University Freshers' Fair. And over those years, the issues that young people have brought of freshers have varied. They've changed, and therefore, you've got to make sure you're listening to them, whether it's through the amazing young liberals or through opinion polls and so on. Let's make sure we have a really acute ear to their concerns. But I do think a strong position on climate change, a strong position on housing and jobs, they will win their votes.
Thank you, Ed. Layla.
I am absolutely determined that we are going to be the party for young people again, just as we were actually when I was at university. I mean, the first time that I voted Lib Dem was when Charles Kennedy took the stance that he did against Iraq, but also because at the time, actually, it was quite cool to vote Lib Dem. And I think that's a space we can absolutely occupy again. And you do that by not just listening, but also acting on what young people say they really care about. And top of the list every single time is climate, is the climate emergency, the nature emergency. And in fact, I've already helped them to have their voices heard. In Oxford, when we had that first Friday for Futures strikes, and I was surrounded by 2,000 young people with placards, and they were screaming from the tops of their lungs that they didn't feel there was anyone in Westminster that listened to them, that was advocating on their behalf for this huge emergency, and that they were going to be the generations who were going to have to carry it through. I made a solemn promise that I would go and the next day do something about it. And so I called the first debate on the floor of the House in 2.5 years on climate change. And then off the back of that, I worked cross-party with Caroline Lucas and Ed Miliband to bring Greta Thunberg to Parliament, met the Speaker, spoke to parliamentarians, held Michael Gove to account. And since then, there is a movement of young people in this country who can begin to see that the Liberal Democrats get it. We get the urgency. And it's not just that, it's also on progressive values in our society. It's also about social justice. It's also about Britain's place in the world. It's why so many young people were with us in our Stop Brexit stance. We need to not just listen to them, we need to show them that we are willing to stand up for them and act. And I am convinced that we can win their votes back, because if we don't, then how on earth are we going to build that base of support that stays with us over time, that takes us out of the single digits polling over the next 5 to 10 years? I don't want to be a leader for just a few years. I want to take these opportunities and drive them through the medium and the long term. And by making us a party that is attractive to young people, that's how we start to win back that support.
Layla, thank you very much. You both talked about the importance of young people, and now let's have a question from Camillo, who is under 18. And he asked this: during the last Parliament, the Lib Dems made a name for themselves through opposition to Brexit, gaining considerable attention in the press and recognition among the public. Now that the battle for Brexit is all but lost, how would you ensure that the Lib Dems are noticed by the public during these troubled times? Layla, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you. Well, this is one of the problems we have. I mean, I remember talking to neighbours actually just a few days ago, and wishing me luck for this endeavour, which is lovely, and then them saying, but where are, what's going on with the party? And we got known for the Stop Brexit stance because it was a distinct stance that got that cut through. And if we don't get that cut through in the media, if we can't make people see that we are relevant on all sorts of different issues, liberal issues, then we aren't going to make them take notice, sit up and take notice, and then make the case for that different future for our country that we need. And that's why my ability to attract the media and get our message across is so important. But it's not just about getting us known for anything. We also need to show people that we can get stuff done. And one of the things that I'm most proud of in this period is delivering the coronavirus compensation scheme. Now, this is a very Lib Dem story. It came off the back of a local constituent who contacted me saying that they're an NHS worker, so's their wife, worried about their 9-year-old daughter, and that they're going out on the front line fighting coronavirus. And they're worried for the financial future of their daughter if they passed away. And so I started a national campaign. I gathered support for it in the House, because from the place we are now, if we're going to get stuff done, we have to collaborate cross-party, including backbench Tory MPs. And then I got a call from the Daily Express newspaper. Now, I nearly fell off my chair at this point, because they tend to not call Lib Dems in a way that's positive, and they only tend to cover us negatively. But they wanted to positively cover this story and credit the party for it. And they put it on their front pages for 5 days running. They used their one question at the Number 10 briefing to raise this. And a few weeks later, it was announced that those bereaved families would get £60,000 that they don't otherwise get. And so it's not just about getting noticed. It's also about using the media to get stuff done, because by getting stuff done for people from the position that we are now, that's how we start to rebuild trust and credibility with them. They can then answer the question, why vote Lib Dem? Because it will get stuff done that really matters.
Thank you very much. And Ed?
The key thing for a leader is to show message discipline and to keep on campaigning on an issue when you know you're right. That's what I learned from Paddy and Charles. And in my brief time as acting leader, I think I've done that on the proposal that there should be an independent inquiry into the government's shambolic handling of COVID. I was the first politician to raise that and call for that. I've kept on about it in the media, in Parliament. And just last week, I tracked Boris Johnson. He's committed to an independent inquiry. I don't think he meant to, but I phrased the question and got him. Now, that got huge media cut through. And I'm really proud that I stuck to my guns and got that. And given that COVID and the inquiry into the COVID is going to be the big issue for probably the rest of this Parliament, we've now positioned ourselves, I position the party well as the leading party championing that inquiry. And I think you therefore need to think about what are going to be the big issues in this Parliament. They're clearly going to be the economy, and they're clearly going to be caring. Those two come from the COVID crisis. And on the economy, I believe I've got the know-how. You know, I'm an economist by training. I degree in postgraduate, put myself through night school for my postgraduate. I was been the economics advisor to the party, been on treasury secretaries and so on. So the economy is my area. And I want to make us distinctive on that. So I want to talk about the green agenda, the green economy, the green jobs. And because I delivered on that when I was a cabinet minister on climate change, I think we can really be clear that we could be distinctive on that, because we've got the best record, frankly. And then I come on to caring. Given the failure of the government on caring, given that people like Munira Wilson has championed that for the Liberal Democrats, I think I can really focus on that. And having been a young carer, having cared for my gran for 10 years when she was very elderly, and then caring for my disabled son, I think I can talk about that with a degree of authenticity in the way that others can't. And so I hope proving that I got the cut through on the inquiry, but also being very strong on the two key issues of the economy and caring, and having a distinctive addition to that through my personal life and my political experience, I hope that will get us some cut through if I'm leader.
Thank you, Ed. We now move on to a question from David, who asks, what will you do to redress the growing inequality in wealth and income that is at the root of so many social problems? And he adds a rider, please will you give specifics, not just aspirations, please? Ed, if you'd like to kick us off.
Do you know, I think inequality and poverty is one of the massive challenges going forward. It's one of the reasons why I'm talking about a greener, fairer, more caring society. And that fairness agenda that is part of my leadership bid builds around a number of issues as specifics, because David, that's what you wanted. So first of all, I talk about the universal basic income. And I know a lot about it because I helped Paddy when we first put it into practice. I understand how you can make it affordable. And I published this week an idea of a sovereign wealth fund, which would enable us to use the COVID economics we've seen to find other ways of ensuring we can pay for a universal basic income, because that really helps the people who are most vulnerable, the homeless, the unpaid carers, the young people who are between jobs and going around the country. So I'm committed to that as a big part of my agenda. But then I come back to housing. You know, I've done surgeries for my constituents for 20 years. I've helped tens of thousands of them with their problems. And there's no doubt that housing is the biggest issue when it comes to inequality. We've got to tackle that. And then I'd also think about regions. You know, we have some very poor regions where regional policies fail to take prosperity and wealth. We're going to spread it around the country. And by the way, the green agenda does that really well. And finally, it has to be education. You know, equality of opportunity for children and young people, that has to be a top priority. It's one of the reasons why, you know, Paddy was so vehement on it, and I helped him with Don, actually. Don, you were there doing so much work on education. And what drove us in that wasn't just education for education's sake, it was a social justice agenda. It's why we came up, and I helped develop the policy of a pupil premium to help the most disadvantaged children the most. And that's what I would want to drive through the party, and I hope the party would come with me, so we were seen as the party that cared the most about inequality and had the best policies for tackling poverty.
Thank you very much, Ed. Leila.
Well, thank you, David, for your question, because this is very much why I came into politics in the first place. I was a teacher for a long time before I was an MP, but actually what really got me going was when I did a master's in comparative education at the Institute of Education. And I realized that inequality in this country was massive, and educational inequality in this country was massive. And this is having lived, I mean, I grew up a bit all over the place. When I was 5, my family moved to Ethiopia, very, very poor at the time, in the late 80s, under a dictator called Mengistu, who was far more interested in waging war with Eritrea than feeding his own people. We then lived in places like Jamaica and Jordan, beautiful places, but also not at all having the economic wealth that we have in this country. And I just think as a G7 country, we have no excuse for children to go to bed hungry at night, which is what is happening. And not just in parts where you'd expect elsewhere outside of London and the Southeast, but I live in Oxford, and here if you go 5 miles that way, life expectancy drops by over 10 years. This is why I am in politics. But what would I do specifically? Well, I refer you to education, the environment, and the economy. Education has to be top. We have to make sure that every child leaves school not just exam ready, but world ready. And I've changed our party's policies over the last 3 years to reflect the research that I was doing in that master's, but also keeping up with it. The environment, because actually the best way out of COVID is a green recovery, but a green recovery can disproportionately help those at the bottom, especially by retrofitting homes so that you're cutting fuel bills. Actually, disproportionately, this is the way to help in a most progressive way. But that economy bit, it's an economy right now that doesn't work for everyone. And I've spoken about putting well-being at its heart, similar to what New Zealand has done with their economy, investing in other indicators other than just the classic GDP indicator. Growth is not enough. It's also about sustainability. And I just want for a moment to give credit to all the Lib Dem councils out there who are putting sustainability at the heart of their plans for their communities, who have recognized over the years that cutting Sure Starts, cutting youth centres are counterproductive. We need to start as a country to plan for the medium and the long term, and developing other indicators alongside GDP would help the government to invest in a way that was serious about our country's future and stop being so short-termism.
Leila, thank you very much. Reference has already been made in some of the remarks to universal basic income. And Chris Ionis and a number of other people have asked about this. Can you explain how you see the universal basic income working, and how do you propose it be funded? Leila, if you could kick us off.
Thank you. So, I mean, my journey towards universal basic income is one where I would have described it before as actually I was very much on where the party's policy is at the moment. I was advocating on behalf of local councils who wanted to run trials. I'm a scientist in my background. I did physics at Imperial College. So my view is if there's something like this that is going to be quite expensive, let's get some data. Let's see how it would work in our country before you rolled it out. So that's where I was before COVID. But let me tell you what happened on the day of lockdown. I mean, my post bag tripled in terms of the number of people who were writing in, and not 38 degrees style, all the same email. No, it was people who were facing destitution, who had just lost their jobs, who didn't know how they were going to pay the next bill, and who were suddenly finding themselves in the position where they used to have a job. Now they've got 2 degrees and no job and using a food bank. I mean, this is the kind of thing that we're seeing in our society at the moment. And so my view on how you pay for it is, at the moment, it is right that the government creates a safety net for everybody. Universal credit is not working. It takes far too long for the money to come through, and it's letting far too many fall through the cracks. So a UBI in this instance, set at a level where you could at least make sure that your basic bills were paid, I think is the right thing to do. And then that would allow us to amass the data that we need to decide if we wanted to continue after it. But actually, the other point I'd make is the specifics of this, I do think, need to be run through the party. And it is the job of the leader to reflect what they're seeing in wider society. And this is why I'm a big fan of a universal basic income now. But it is absolutely right that the party does properly deliberate on this. And I will be asking the party to do that through the Federal Policy Committee. I think we do need an answer to how you pay for it, and it needs to be specific. And I don't think it's the job of the leader to come up with the specifics of that, but the broad thrust that no one gets left behind under the Liberal Democrats, that's the part that really attracts me to a UBI.
Thank you. Ed?
Let's remember why a UBI is important. There are many of the most vulnerable in society who fall through the current welfare net. Let me talk about unpaid carers. There are millions of them. They don't manage to qualify for a carer's allowance, but they're still working hours on end looking after people. Then there's homeless people who, can't pass the tests, and they lose out too. There's the 1.2 million people who are totally unbanked and often miss out again. And I'm fed up of going to my surgeries week in, week out over 20 years and seeing how the welfare system is failing the most vulnerable. And that's why I've long been a fan of UBI. I helped devise the policy for the party back in 1989-90 when we called it the citizen's income. And that's why I've got a lot to contribute to the party's debate when we have that debate about how you pay for it. First of all, there are a lot of people who wouldn't get any extra money from what they're getting now, because I think the personal tax allowance, the basic state pension, that they're effectively a citizen's income, but they're being paid to people, some people, but it's not being paid to others. So quite a lot of people wouldn't get any extra money. The people who would get money that aren't getting it now are those people who would fail the conditionality tests that are put on by the strict Tory welfare system. And so what I think we have an opportunity now is to revisit this, look at the sums, and there's something really special now using COVID economics. What do I mean? The government has lent out tens of billions of pounds to businesses. And that debt, I don't think in many cases is going to be repaid. And rather than seeing those businesses fail, we've got to work out what we're going to do about that debt. And I like the idea of turning that debt into shares that we all hold as a country, a classic debt for equity swap for those of you in business. And those shares could be in a sovereign wealth fund, and we could add to that, and we could create dividends that are paid out to help pay for a universal basic income, a citizen's income. I've been doing some work on this, and if you look at pensions funds elsewhere, if you look at sovereign wealth funds that have been created by other countries, this is a real opportunity. And so that's part of the way I would pay for it. But clearly we need to discuss it with the party. There are a number of other alternatives, but I think I've got some really interesting ideas, both from my time when I actually did this, but also some new thinking post-COVID.
Ed, thank you very much indeed. We're moving on to a question from Nick. Nick has points out that the recent crisis has led to a number of people changing their minds on some quite important issues. And so Nick's question to both of you is, what's the biggest issue on which you've changed your mind, and what made you change it? And we'll start with Ed.
Oh, very good question. What's the biggest issue I've changed my mind? I guess on housing. I guess when I first got into politics, the whole housing debate was about, housing benefit being the best way, giving people money rather than giving people council homes. The debate was all about housing associations and that they were much better than councils. over time, I just don't get that anymore. I don't believe it anymore, because the housing benefit idea of subsidising housing, it assumes that tenants have a real choice, and actually they don't. And it can be a subsidy to poor landlords. And people think that, you know, housing associations, because they're not for profits, are somehow always and everywhere better than councils. That's not my experience. You know, they often pay their executives lots of money, and the boards don't have tenants on them. They're not very democratic or accountable. So I've gone back to sort of, you might call it a bit sort of social democrat, if you like. I'm not afraid of that. I've gone back to more support for council housing, core council housing, housing that is owned by the council, that they can decide, you know, through a proper policy to make sure they're helping the most vulnerable in society. And I actually think a really big boost on council housing is something that now makes sense to me in a way which I think 20, 30 years ago we weren't thinking about. And I'd like the party to think about, can we sort of re-engineer the housing benefit system? So rather than giving all the subsidies to bad landlords, we get it into the bricks and mortar and build the houses. That's what I like to do. And, you know, finally, I've been even more convinced by this post-coronavirus. The coronavirus has shown how poor housing can have so many bad effects on people's health, not just through the pandemic, but from mental health. How it can impact the welfare and the chances of the children. So I'm even more inspired to make sure that we get housing right. This is our chance. We've got to stop, you know, I know it's difficult, and I'm sure there's some councillors watching this who you know, are worried about council housing in their area. I just think we've got to be on the front foot on it. I think we've got to oppose some of the NIMBYs that we sometimes see in our constituencies and our wards. You know, work with them, show that we have a sustainable approach, but we have to be the champion of housing and council housing. And I never used to think that, but now I really, really do.
Ed, thank you. Layla.
Thank you. Well, I've had a bit longer to think about it, and I still actually don't think that there's very much. I have changed my mind about Turn On. I mean, I mentioned UBI and how before coronavirus I was more curious about it, and now I'm dead set for it. So that perhaps is a change of mind. But actually, interestingly, this period, speaking to friends and family and everybody, I think people have been reflecting on what's really important in their lives, and how all of a sudden those things that we just took for granted now seem so important. And one is nature. And I really hope that we can hold on to some of this, because there is a different Britain, a different future for this country that has been just glimpsed through this period, that is not negative, it's a positive. And yes, there's going to be some very difficult times to come in this country, but there is space for a political party that is making the case for keeping some of the best that we've seen. And one of them is the interaction that we have in our communities, is the way that people are connecting, in the way that local councils have been driving communities to be there for each other. There is another way of running our country, and it's bottom up, and it's liberal, and it's green. And so this is one of the reasons why, actually one of the things I've tweaked my thinking on is we need to really supercharge our stance on the green recovery. And I talk about now not just aiming for carbon neutral as a country. Why don't we aim for carbon negative? Let's really capture the hearts and minds of the country with this. And we've seen what it can do. All the changes that we've made, by the way, have only decreased global output by 4 to 7%. There was a report that came out this week that said that actually already behavior is going back to where it was before. It can be different, but let's not be complacent about that change. We need to make sure that we are front and center for making the case for that change for the whole of the country, because there is a different way that we could be living. And I think it's something that the Liberal Democrats should be front and center of championing.
Thank you, Layla. And you may wish to continue the theme you just started in answer to the question from Stephen, who asks, what would your plans be if elected in challenging the government to deal with the climate emergency? So.
Thank you. Well, they have not got it, have they? They just haven't got it. And we've seen from the recovery package that they've put forward that it's tinkering around the edges, but it's not really dealing with the core issue. And what studies have shown, and there was one done in Smith School in Oxford quite recently, is that a green recovery is actually a better recovery for the environment, for the economy at this time, because the environment is a way of investing in, for example, replanting. It's a way of changing people from skills that perhaps are going to be underused, whether it be because they are in the tourism industry, in the leisure industry. They are really going to be struggling over the next few years. So what is it that we can do to actually encourage people to retrain and then train into industries that are going to grow? So it's a win-win situation. But the question was, how do we influence government? And actually the way that we, from the position that we are now, influence government is actually, there's two main ways. One is we need to use the media positively to make the case for higher environmental standards. And we can, and that's what I've been doing. I've been working with actually strange bedfellows. People like the Telegraph have been working with me on why sustainable transport really matters. And the reason why they care is actually there's a lot of places that don't have good transport links in their towns and villages. And that's forcing people back into cars when they don't want to be going back into cars. They want to have more investment in those more classic sort of rural Tory facing areas. And so I've been working with them on that. And that's how you get to Boris Johnson, because that's the newspaper that he reads. But the other way you do it is you also make the case for it in the House. And that's why cross-party working, collaborative working is what we now need to achieve. Because if we're going to show people that we can really change policy, we do it by working with other parties on these massive issues.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Well, two things. First of all, what we do in the UK and what we do internationally. On the UK, everyone's talking about a green recovery, but I fear that the government and even the Labour Party have far too timid approach. They don't seem to understand the sheer scale and urgency of the climate emergency, and that's what we've got to get over. You know, when I was the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, I had to fight the Tories. They didn't want to take it on seriously. I nearly quadrupled Britain's renewable power. I signed off more solar and wind farms than any British politician in history. And the policies helped create the offshore wind industry that we have now. And we're a world leader. And what I'd like us to do is, in that scale and ambition, is apply that to other technologies which are going to be so crucial in the future. Take flight, for example. I think we should be investing a huge amount of money into either the electric flight or the hydrogen flight of the future to make sure that we are a world leader in green flight. But you've also got to work internationally if you're serious about the climate emergency. You know, we're just 2% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that means we've got to work with the EU and the UN, with partners across the world, whether it's on rainforests, whether it's on spreading renewables, all those different issues. And having led the UK delegation at the United Nations on 3 occasions for the climate talks, and having led a climate diplomacy across the European Union and got the rest of Europe to agree to my really very ambitious climate change targets, I think I know how that can be done. And I've been making sure that in the run up to COP26, which the UK is hosting, we had a really ambitious agenda on green finance and decarbonising capitalism, those big economic issues, but also on how we can show that if you're serious about greening the world society, you can also tackle world poverty and you can reduce wars. You can tackle world poverty because renewable energy can get to the billion poorest in rural Africa, rural Latin America, rural India, rural Asia that don't get it at the moment. And those children, those people can keep their medicines cool, their food cool, they can learn and study for longer, than get involved in the economy because electricity would come to them through micro solar grids. And you also reduce conflict because you'd be giving less money to the fossil fuel producers in the Kremlin, in Saudi Arabia, in Venezuela. They'd not be able to suppress their people and sow conflict and terrorism. So I would make the argument internationally, yes, we've got to be serious about climate change to save our planet, but we can make our world so much better in so many ways if we really embrace the green agenda with a passion that I think we need to.
Thank you, Ed. We now move on to a question posed by a number of party members, Brenda, Paul, James, and others. And broadly, they say this, that pandemics, not nuclear attacks, have been designated as tier 1 threats to our security. So why does our party continue to support replacing Trident at a cost of billions when the money would be better spent on dealing with the consequences of COVID-19. And they also add, if we still have a nuclear deterrent and you were in a position to have responsibility, would you be prepared to press the button? Ed.
Well, our party's policy on Trident, let's be clear, is not to replace Trident like for like. I would certainly be against that. I've been a committed multilateral disarmament person all my life, and I think we need to step up the argument for global disarmament. But I think the replacement of Trident, as party policy says, must be a real build down, so we can show that we're adhering to our international obligations under the nuclear non-proliferation treaties. So I think that is a step forward. But I wouldn't want to give it up, because the world is extremely dangerous at the moment. It's very uncertain. I've never known global security to be so uncertain, particularly with the tensions between China and the United States. So I don't think this is the moment for unilateral disarmament, though I of course would love to have global disarmament. I think also I would slightly question the presumption of the question. I'm not sure if it's either or. The costs of dealing with a pandemic and preparing for a pandemic are much, much less. And one of the reasons why I was so pleased to win the commitment to an independent inquiry from the Prime Minister last week is that in that inquiry, we can show that the Tories were told at a relatively small cost they could have prepared for any pandemic. There was a pandemic simulation. It was called the Cygnus exercise in 2016. And guess what it showed? That we needed more PPE, that we needed more ventilators, that we needed more critical care beds. It was all written. And for 3 years, they ignored it, not because of the cost. They were so busy with Brexit. So, let's not tie ourselves up in knots here, particularly amongst ourselves. Let's go for the Tories. Let's show how shambolic they've been over this pandemic, how they failed to prepare, how they locked down too late, how they failed on PPE, on testing, and how they failed our people in our care homes. It's a tragedy, and we should all be angry about that. They have let our people down, and we must be the champions to expose that. And that independent inquiry is going to be absolutely critical.
Ed, thank you. Just before I bring in Layla, though, you haven't answered the final bit of the question, which is, were you in a position to do it and we still had a nuclear deterrent, would you be prepared to press the button?
The whole point of having a nuclear deterrent is you've got to give the message out to people that you do so. Otherwise, you don't have there's no point of having a deterrent, right? So if you're going to spend the money, publicly, you've got to say you would use it. Otherwise, if you don't say that, total waste of money and time.
Thank you, Ed. Layla.
Well, first of all, I think I want to just make my stance absolutely clear. I want a world where there are no nuclear weapons at all. And it's right that we signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. And what I regret is that we are still nowhere closer to multilateral disarmament, which is what that treaty was all about. So I support our party's stance, because it would be, in the context of global politics as it is right now, a strong signal that as a country, we are stepping down the amount of money that we're spending on this, because we are serious about multilateral disarmament. I'm not a unilateralist, I'm a multilateralist. I'm a liberal because I believe that you do things like this with our other countries, with our international partners. But actually, sometimes you have to take a lead. So I support the stepping down, but I wouldn't want it to stop there. I would then want that to then continue and continue and continue until we have a world where we don't have to rely on the mass destruction of other human beings in our planet, very millions of innocents who would die from this. And to the pressing of the button, my goodness me, it would be an absolute last resort, and not something that should be taken lightly. To the point of the pandemic, though, quite separately, I mean, I actually think that you need to also prepare for those. You need to make sure that you are taking those seriously. It's been far too long that not just pandemics, but also the climate emergency and the nature emergency are taken as seriously. And on the country's risk register, it's there, but the government have not taken it seriously enough, and they do need to be held to account. And that's why I'm chairing the all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus. And what we are trying to do, and I'm all for Boris Johnson having his own inquiry. And if it's a public inquiry and it's judge-led, it should absolutely hold people to account, but it's probably going to happen after the fact. It's probably going to be too late in order to do what we need to do now, which is to save lives before a second wave. So the purpose of the rapid parliamentary inquiry that I'm leading cross-party, including former Tory ministers are on it, is to hold them to account immediately, so that we can then feed into government to make sure that they aren't going to miss this opportunity to avert any future disasters. And just finally, the reason why we need to keep talking about not just the climate emergency, but also the nature emergency, is that that is what makes pandemics more likely. It is more likely that these novel viruses are going to jump from animals to humans if their habitats are destroyed in the way that they have. It's why all the policy that we've been putting forward around rewilding, but also changes to, you know, the international food chains and agriculture industries, these are so important, because unless we change everything about how society operates, then we are going to find that pandemics are going to be more likely rather than less likely. And surely the point after COVID is to build back better, is to build back more resilience in not just this country, but across the world against this kind of catastrophe happening ever again. And there is a space for the Liberal Democrats to be front and center of making that case to our country, to lead from the front on those issues, not just at home, but also abroad.
Thank you, Layla. Andy points out that the party has got an incredible set of ideals, but fears that very often we don't seem to have the passion and excitement about them. So his question is, how are either of you going to bring that passion and excitement back into the things that we all believe in? And Layla, if you'd kick us off.
Well, thank you. That's exactly what we need to do. And out there, you know, we have to make the case. We have to make that positive case for liberalism again. And that's what I'm absolutely intent on doing. And we have so many wonderful, wonderful people making policies in our party. It's why I was attracted to the party. I joined in a very geeky way. I was most interested in which party had the best policies to tackle educational inequality. And actually, I was I always knew I was sort of more centre left, but I didn't really have one particular party that I would consider. I would probably have not been a Tory, not least because my family would have killed me. But other than that, I did actually look across the piece at all the political parties, what they were saying about education, did a table of what they were saying versus what the research said, graded it up, and then actually landed on the Lib Dems. And is it any surprise that I did? Because we are so research based and we make such great policy. But where we often fail is in that communication to people, to show how it's relevant to them. And it starts by listening to them. It starts by talking to them and understanding their point of view across the country. And that's what I need to spend that first year of leadership. That's what I want to do, out on doors talking to people. If the party creates the prose, then the job of the leader is to do that poetry, is to really speak to people's hearts and not just their minds. And in order to do that, you need to know your audience. So that's why it's so important that we now go back to basics as a party. If we are going to revive and we are going to make that positive case for liberalism again, then it all starts by thinking about the voter. We can do this, guys, but let's make sure that this is the moment where we seize this opportunity to actually make it happen.
Thank you, Layla. Ed.
Andy, you're right about passion, but passion needs to be relevant to voters. People need to see where it's coming from and that it's credible, not fake. And I like to think on the caring agenda, which is going to be so important post-COVID. I can bring a degree of authenticity because of my personal experience, you know, caring for my mum when she was terminally ill, caring for my gran for 10 years when she was frail and elderly, now caring for my disabled son. And that caring agenda, I feel, certainly with my constituents, has enabled me to put myself in their shoes. And when they come to talk to me, particularly parents of special needs kids, they know that I get them. And the gratitude is quite palpable. And so I think showing that you as a person can relate to people, that will get their passion, and that's what counts, being relevant to people's lives. And I like to think I can do that on the green agenda because of my political record, which is, I think is pretty good. But I think you've got to go beyond that. And as a leader, there'll be issues that will come along, which we don't yet know. And the question is, are you going to have the guts to take the right response? So, I remember when Paddy spoke up about the rights of Hong Kong Chinese, and, we were the party that was going to give them the right to come to this country. He got ridiculed for that. But he stood up, and I was so proud of him when he did that. And of course, on Bosnia. And I like to think on one or two things in my constituency, I've done similar things. Probably the one that I'm proudest of, which shows the liberal passion for human rights, was when I helped get a constituent out of Guantanamo Bay. Guy was called Bisha Arouri, and he had been rendered illegally by the CIA to the Bagram airport in Afghanistan. He'd been tortured. He then took on to Guantanamo Bay, and he was my constituent, from a guy from New Malden. And so I took his case in Parliament with the Foreign Office, and I went to Washington. I went to Washington twice. I went to the State Department. I went to the Pentagon, and I tell you, in the press, they were ridiculing me. I had the Sun saying, "Who does he think this is, standing up for this alleged Islamic terrorist?" Except they didn't bother with the alleged bit. The truth was, when I got Bisha out of Guantanamo Bay, I couldn't have been more proud, because it was, for me, ignoring the right-wing press, ploughing on with liberal democrat ideals of human rights and individuals and respect for individuals. And now the fact that Bisha's living in West London, he's got married, he's got 3 kids, never charged, he didn't do anything. He was guilty by association. And so I think the way you show your passion to the voters is by being authentic and not fake, people really getting that you understand it, you get it, but also having the guts to stand up to those issues, whether it's, as Paddy did with Hong Kong, or I did in a much smaller way for my constituents getting out of Guantanamo Bay.
Ed, thank you very much. You both mentioned in earlier remarks the issue of education, but David asks, why isn't education at the very top of ours and every other party's agenda? He says it should be, because it's the route towards the country creating a better egalitarian society for all, equal opportunity for every child, irrespective of their parents' wealth. So why isn't it #1 priority for our party, at least? And we'll start with Ed.
Well, I think both Leila and I and Don and everybody in the party are passionate about education. I guess the question that I put back to you is, we also have to make sure we're speaking to the voters' concerns. And clearly education is there, there's no doubt about that. And we should be the champions of it, because, just as you say, it's so important for creating a liberal society and getting the best out of every individual human being. But we've also got to win those elections, and winning is critical. So we've got to listen to the voters, what's on the top of their minds. And while education is in there, it's not at the top 3 or 4 at the moment. So we should be championing it. Yes, it should be part of our distinctive agenda, our passion. But I do think we also have to talk about jobs and the economy. That's going to be critical in the years ahead, and caring, and the climate change. But it's how we talk about education, I think, might help you, and some of my ideas and some of my records. So, with Don and Paddy and others, I developed the policy of a penny on income tax. That was seen as hugely brave at the time, actually asking people to pay more taxes for education. Back then, it was seen as madness. And it was our top policy. And it really got cut through in 92, 97, and 2001 elections. So I was really proud of being part of that. And then I was education spokesman for just 14 months, and I developed the policy of the pupil premium. Nick Clegg had written about it, and I developed the policy with the Liberal Democrat Education Association. And then we got it into government, helping the most disadvantaged children. And what I'm talking about in this leadership election in terms of the future education policies that I think we should be championing are particularly early years, preschool, reception, first year. All the evidence shows that's when you can make the biggest difference. So I really think it's very much up there, but I think we've also got to recognize there are 1 or 2 other issues that the voters are caring about too.
Leila. Leila, I
I'm
think you're
muted.
still muted.
David, yeah, I think I accidentally muted myself. This does happen on Zoom all the time, doesn't it? Sorry about that, guys. David, your question is music to my ears, because as you might have noticed from the platform that I'm putting forward for the party, I do think it should be top. But the reason why I think it should be top is because it came off the back of conversations that I was having with voters on the doors. Actually, at the end of the election afterwards, I really wanted to answer the question, what do voters want from us? How can we make sure that we're really speaking to their concerns? And I went door knocking. I went to Yorkshire, I went to Wales, I went to Devon and Cornwall, I went to Kent, and places where we don't already hold seats. And what I discovered was that people really want us to talk about public services. But in particular, they could see that education was a gap in the market for us, because they felt that NHS and social care Labour kind of have occupied that ground, and it's very important we keep talking about it, especially in the context of COVID. But that gap in the market is of a party of education that invests in its next generations. And my key proposition is that what we need is an education system that makes children world ready, not just exam ready. And the way that I propose that we deliver that is by building a coalition of people, not just in Parliament, but also relying on the research, relying on business to help us redefine what the system looks like. And it's also where we've shown that we are strong. Kirsty Williams in Wales is doing an incredible job of making us the party of education in Wales, because she is Secretary of State of Education in Wales. And if you want to see a great example of how to do it, Gavin Williamson, then all he needs to do is to look at what Lib Dems do when they get hold of that brief. So I think, David, you and I are on exactly the same page. Let's be the party of education again. What better way of saying to people what liberalism means in a way that is very easy for them to understand?
Leila, thank you very much. And both of you have said education is going to be very high on our political agenda, even top. But Sue, Tim, and Malcolm all wonder whether proportional representation should also be higher on our agenda than it currently is. Leila, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, coming back to the door knocking examples, you knock on a door, knock, knock, knock. Hi, I'm Leila here campaigning on behalf of the Liberal Democrats. And then if you start talking about electoral reform, the average voter, first of all, often doesn't have a clue what that means. If they do, they're probably a Lib Dem already, or if they're not, you really should ask them to join. But we need to make the case for electoral reform, absolutely, but we need to do it in a way that makes people understand why they should care. And it comes right back to what lies at the heart of my liberalism. It's that freedom, it's that empowered citizen, where decisions are taken closest to the people that those decisions affect. And the problem with the system that we have now is that for far too many people in this country, their votes essentially don't matter. It's the blue ribbon, blue rosette on a donkey situation. We need to stop this. And that's why proportional representation really matters. How are we going to get it? Well, actually, the place that we need to win this argument in is partly in the electorate, but also, and I think the tactical voting stuff that was happening at the last election started to wake people up to how unsatisfactory it was to not be able to express their true heart when it comes to their vote, but it's also in the House. And I mentioned earlier, I'm already part of cross-party working going on in the House to try and make the case across the political parties as a whole that this is something that we need to be delivering as a political class.
Thank you. Ed.
Sue, Tim and Malcolm, I share your passion for PR, but I have to tell you, I've been knocking on doors for 30 years. I've been a member of Parliament for 20 years. I've knocked on doors in almost every parliamentary by-election over that time across the whole of the United Kingdom. And I have to say, it's come up on about 2 or 3 occasions when I was speaking to Liberal Democrat Party members. So I'm sorry, at the moment, it's just not the issue that will win us the votes. And until you win, you can't do anything about it, right? The more that you win at council level and at national level, the more MPs that we get, the more likely we are to be able to change the electoral system. So, my winning strategy when I'm campaigning is to make sure I know what the voters' concerns are, not what Liberal Democrat concerns are, because, there's not enough of us. What are the voters' concerns are, and what's a Liberal Democrat message to those on the jobs, on the economy, on the climate, on education, on care? And then hopefully we win the votes, and then you can start doing something about it. And I am actually more optimistic about the chance for PR than I have been in my political lifetime. And it's because that Labour need PR. Back in the 1990s, when I was working with Paddy and Paddy was working with Blair, the Labour Party were not convinced about electoral reform. They were convinced about Scottish devolution, freedom of information, but not electoral reform. And they reneged on everything they'd said prior to 97. Now I think it's different. They've lost all those seats that Blair had in Scotland. They've started losing seats in the north of England. They're not going to win by themselves in the first past the post. So I think Labour strategists are thinking about it. And frankly, it's not in Parliament we're going to win this. It's within the Labour Party. If the Labour Party changes, and I'm told nearly 3/4 of members now support PR, if they put it in their manifesto prior to the next election, then we really are game on, and that could transform British politics. If they don't, and still sort of, around the edges, then we've got to have some tough negotiations if we're in a chance to influence, say a minority Labour government. And for me, it would be absolutely critical. And, I've negotiated in government, I've negotiated in business, I've negotiated the UN or the EU. I sort of know how to negotiate. And the key thing you do in going to negotiation is you put your bottom line, something that they don't want to give you. And if they haven't committed to it prior to the election, they want to give it to us, but we will get it because I will make it a top priority. And that's how you have to play the politics. You want to win the votes, and then you've got to negotiate with your opponents to get what you need.
Thank you, Ed. Now, both of you will be well aware that our region is a particularly rural one, and a number of people have asked rural questions. Maika and Don, for example, say that the threat of Brexit and the reality of the pandemic have created huge challenges for our farmers and others in our rural communities. What is your strategy for the rural economy, Ed?
Well, I would start with farmers, and I'd be really concerned about how they are being affected by Brexit, by a potential trade deal with the United States, where animal welfare, food standards look like they're going to be tossed to the wind by the Tories. And I think if we oppose them really strongly in Parliament and the media, actually this is a political opportunity for us. Because I think a lot of farmers who might have supported the Tories in the past might begin to think the Tories have forgotten them. So I think that is an opportunity for us. We've got to stand up for those animal welfare standards, for those food standards that we had in the European Union, and we need to be the champions for them. But when I think about the rural community, it's not just farming. My wife stood for Parliament 3 times in North Dorset, a very rural community, and the issues there were things like rural transport, public transport, which could be non-existent in some areas because the Tories deregulated it. I would re-regulate it. Post offices, where when I was a minister responsible, I managed to stop all the closures that had been going on because I knew how important post offices were for rural communities. And I got all the banks to make sure you could access your bank account through a post office. Actually, I did that. So that was important for the rural economy there. And I'd also want to stress things like broadband, which is so patchy in many rural areas. And if one thing we've learned about COVID, the need to make sure that people can work from home has never been more important. And so getting really reliable, fast broadband in our rural areas should be a really big priority for a rural economy package. So yes, farming. Let's try and see if we can be the champion of farmers. Tim Farron, I think, is doing a great job on that. But I think we also need to have some other policies which really show that we understand rural communities.
Thank you, Ed. Leila.
When people think of Oxford, Western Abingdon, I know they often fixate on the Oxford bit, but actually there is a large part of my constituency that is quite rural. And we have small villages that are really underserved by buses, by local transport. We've got small schools, small primaries, for example, are really struggling to survive on funding formulas that aren't delivering for them. And in the surrounding Oxfordshire area, we've got lots and lots of farms. There's a few actually in my constituency itself. And I think there is actually an opportunity here for us as Lib Dems, because a lot of the farming community did vote for Brexit. But interestingly, if you look at what the National Farmers Union and others are now saying about the trade deal that Boris Johnson wants to strike, particularly with Trump, that it undermines animal rights and environmental standards for farmers. And this is a great opportunity. I think the Liberal Democrats need to be front and centre this. And I've actually been working with some strange bedfellows on this issue exactly. I got a story into the Daily Mail the other day. Again, a newspaper I tend to read, but I know that there's a lot of people we need to win over who read that newspaper. And the reason why they carried this positive story, which was a story around challenging Liz Truss to eat a meal of chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed beef, was because there are lots of people out there, many Tory voters, who are very, very concerned about the slipping of our high British standards, the standards that we have pushed in the EU, and who don't want to move away from them. And if we're going to be headed for a no-deal Brexit, and as we've seen in global geopolitics right now, it's clear that Boris Johnson is cozying up to Trump, as opposed to looking at our closest trading partner, which is the European Union. That's how we're going to start changing people's minds about the value of the European Union. And over time, slowly, start to win that argument again for why we should have the closest possible union, close customs union in the single market, but then eventually how we're going to start making that case for rejoin. Slowly as she goes, but one day I do want us to be the party that goes there again. But we start by talking to the very real concerns of the rural communities, and especially the farmers in our country, who are about to be sold down the river by Boris Johnson. Don, you're muted now.
Oh, thank you. Well put. Both of our candidates know only too well that the media very often gives you very, very short time to answer questions. So what we're going to do now, so we can get in all the remaining 3 questions that we were keen to get through, I'm going to ask you for very short, snappy answers to what are incredibly complex issues. And I appreciate that. We'll see how you get on. I'm going to start you off with the easiest one and get progressively harder, but very short answers, please. And starting off with Layla, would the option of a 4-day working week aid economic recovery?
We need to give people a chance to work as flexibly as they can. I personally think that we shouldn't be advocating specific numbers of days, but I do think that we need to be making the case for why people should have the right to work flexibly. I'm glad that the government seems to be moving more towards this. At the moment, they can ask to be, but the employer can refuse. I think that should be turned around. If people want to have better work-life balance by working from home and compressing their hours into 4 days rather than 5 as it is now, then I'm all for that. And I think the Lib Dems should be making the case for it, yes.
Ed?
Short answer, no. I think there are many other things that are needed for the recovery. My green recovery package, flexible working, as Leah said, is important, but I think a state-imposed top-down 4-day week would not help.
Thank you. And the second one, this is from Paul, by the way. What will the party's objectives be in relation to bringing Israel into line with UN resolutions, and in particular the current illegal land grab in Palestine? And
the illegal land grab in Palestine has been outrageous, yet another breach of international law. I have argued and written about the need for sanctions against all the products from the West Bank. They're illegal settlements, so the produce from there is illegal. We should have sanctions on that. And of course, we should now take the step of recognizing Palestine as a state. You know, we've faffed about, we've not done it. Now is the time, particularly with this appalling Netanyahu government.
Layla?
This is an issue, of course, close to my heart. I'm the first MP of Palestinian British Palestinian descent in our country's history. And so I speak with a level of personal interest in this. What we need to do, though, as Liberals, is to make the case for international rule-based order. And as you rightly point out, this annexation is absolutely illegal. And it needs to, if it goes ahead, and I think it's worth saying, we need to watch carefully what's actually going to happen in the Knesset, but if it goes ahead, there needs to be consequences. And I think at that point, this is when recognizing the Palestinian state is the right thing to do. We need to show Israel that Britain is going to lead from the front on this. And the House already has a bill ready to go that I've introduced in my name to recognize the state of Palestine. It's the right thing to do. We need to do it now, and it should be something that actually, frankly, has already happened.
Thank you very much. And finally, from John, adult social care remains the Cinderella service and poor relation to health. The government proposals are long overdue. What is your policy and how is it to be funded? Leila.
Thank you. Well, yes, this is absolutely critical right now. And actually, I think our party's policy on this is brilliant. It's funded by the penny on the pound on income tax. One of the most positive canvassing experiences I've ever had is with that policy. And people say, well, one, have two, because they can see how important that it is. There have been commissions after commissions after commissions. It does need to be cross-party, but actually implementing things like the Dilnot review is, I think, the way to go. And so actually, I would urge the government to just get on with it. They need to start those reforms now. And as Simon Stevens says, reform of the adult social care sector may be the very first positive thing that comes out of COVID-19. I hope he's right.
Ed?
Supporting and funding and reforming adult social care is the best way to help the health service, as has been abundantly clear because of COVID. And because I'm standing on a greener, fairer, more caring society, the caring bit is something I want to make sure we're doing, not just in terms of care for the elderly and people with dementia and so on, but also people with mental health problems, the disabled, bereaved families and so on. So caring, I think, is an area where we need to champion. And I think we need to be brave. I think the Dilnot Commission, which I think has got exactly the right answers, that needs to be funded ultimately by the taxpayer. And the reason why I like Dilnot is because it takes an NHS approach to care. What it says is we can't all have private insurance. We need to have social insurance together, not in a social insurance premium way, but socially through the tax system. So our taxes are our social insurance. So we look after each other properly. And that's the great principle behind Dilnot. It reminds me of the Beveridge principles. And I think that's where Liberals need to go. So we should lead the reform. I think we're in a good place to do that. And I think if necessary, it will need higher taxes.
Thank you very much. We now have an opportunity for just a brief final remarks from both of our candidates. We've agreed it'll be just 2 minutes, and we're going to start off with Leila.
Well, thank you, Don. Thank you all for being here. And I've really enjoyed this evening. As Paddy used to say, the Liberal Democrats are at our best when we're fizzing with ideas. And I can feel this fizz right now in the questions from this hustings and the listening sessions I've done with over 300 local parties. We are ambitious as a party, and it's coming from the bottom up. And now more than ever, our country needs to build that bold, progressive, liberal agenda so that we can emerge from this crisis of greener, fairer, more compassionate society. But the challenge for the party is that in order to rebuild trust and support, we have to regain the trust and support of the electorate. We have to do better. We have to rebuild our council base. We have to do better in seats that are Tory facing, but also keep one eye on those Labour facing ones so that we can build for the medium and the long term. Electing me as leader sends a signal to voters that we've learned from our mistakes over the last decade and that we're serious about change. And that we're also living our own values of diversity, embodying our commitment to equality of opportunity, no matter who you are and no matter where you're from. A vote for me is a vote to talk about education, the environment, the economy, these bread and butter issues that people really care about. And it's a vote to move forward together as a party so that we can start to win again. As leader, I will harness our brilliant ideas, enthusiasm and ambition. I will implement that general election review so that we can make sure we are building from the strongest possible base. But I will also, like Paddy and Charles did, make liberalism mainstream again and appeal to that broad base of voters at a time when more than ever, we need to take the fight to the Tories. So please lend me your support in this leadership election and let's move forward together.
Leila, thank you very much indeed. And finally, Ed.
The challenge for the next party leader is how do we get out of the mess that we're in? How do we start winning again, building on the revival we've seen in local government, and start winning more in local government and yes, far more in Westminster. I believe I can do that. I think I can appeal to those soft Tories we're going to have to bring over, as well as a centre-left progressive politician, reassuring those soft Labour voters. And that combination can win us many, many more seats. It's what I've done in Kingston and Surbiton, having fought 7 elections and won 6. I think I have a track record of knowing how to win. And I bring to that critical role for the next leader the fact that I co-commissioned the general election review, which shows all the mistakes that have been being made in the last few years, which have driven me crazy, frankly. And I'm absolutely determined to implement that review so our party is fit for purpose. Our party governs itself properly, our party campaigns properly, and our party is far more diverse. We've got to look like modern Britain, my friends, and we don't at the moment. If we do look like modern Britain, we're going to be more likely to win. So winning is what it's all about. And my theme of the vision of a greener, fairer, more caring society, coupled with my experience of 30 years in the party, 20 years in Parliament, 5 years in government, I think I can bring that to the service of the party. You know, in the east of England, you've been doing great guns. And thank you for your support for Daisy Cooper, the MP for St Albans. She is such a star in the Commons now. And I'm so delighted she's backing me in this leadership election. And the fact you've got so many good leaders in local government, from Stephen Robinson in Chelmsford to Peter Taylor in Watford to Sarah Bedford in Three Rivers, to Bridget Smith in South Cambs, to Chris White in St Albans. I'm probably missed out a few and I apologise for that. But you've shown that we can do it. And I want to be on your side so we win across the east of England, across the whole of the country. I think we can do it. And I think we can change Britain. I think the Liberal time is coming.
Ed, thank you very much. Leila, thank you for joining us. Can I thank all of those who've been with us watching this, very actively commenting on the chatter lines on YouTube. Just before we go, I want to introduce one other person who's done enormous work for the regional party over a number of years, who's got a couple of things to say just to round the evening off. So please, can I introduce Laurie Flawn, the Secretary of our region. Laurie.
Hi.
Hi, Laurie.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Pleased to meet you. On behalf of the East of England region, I'd just like to say thanks very much again to Ed and Leila for giving us, the membership, this opportunity to quiz you in what I hope you'll agree has been an interesting half hour or so of deep dive, but pretty quick fire Q&A. But also to Don Foster, our regional president and very able chair for this event. Even more though, I'd like to say thank you to you, our members, for taking the time to come together in this Zoom call to help us to decide the future of our party. I'd like also to take the opportunity to say a few words from the regional executive. During the pandemic, we are continuing to work hard to support our members and you, and to position ourselves for the next round of the council elections next spring. We're already organising our AGM, which will be held as required in November, that's constitutional, but this time we're going to do that by Zoom. The AGM is the final deadline for nominations to post on the regional executive, but also for representation to English Council. An online election will take place if there's competition for any of the positions. but I'm really asking you seriously to get involved. Nominate yourselves, nominate others. Nomination papers and details of the AGM will be circulated nearer the time. And if there is to be an election, we'll tell you how that's to happen as well. It will also be online. There's an amazing amount of talent in our party. We know that. Please don't hide your lights under bushes. We're planning another conference in February though, like the last one we had, which was a massive success, held at Cambridge Regional College. And we hope there to be able to come together again in person. Again, more details will follow nearer the time, but do have a look on the regional website because there is already information there. We've got our next studio hustings on this subject, and I've been asked to give a plug to that. It's on Wednesday, and it will be about Britain's place in Europe and in the world. It's going to be live on YouTube on Wednesday, so please do sign up for that, especially if you're interested in Europe and the world. There are others, as I'm sure you know, from the website. So just remains for me to say again, thank you all for joining us on this online hustings, and enjoy your evening and enjoy the next hustings. Well done, Ed and Layla. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Good night.
everybody.
Cheers. Bye-bye.